In this video, you're going to learn how to light a cinematic interview with no lights. I recently went on a trip to the Philippines to film a short documentary for my work with the CFL and found myself filming on location interviews in a bunch of different environments. And the common denominator between all of these was I had to film an interview with no light, just me, my camera, and a tripod. So in this video, we're going to talk about the different techniques that I use with regards to filming angles and lighting and where to position your subject to make an interview look good when your resources are limited. So the first interview that we have here is daytime exterior, and this is on location in a public location. So this is what the interview actually looks like when I play it through. And I have a couple notes here that I'm going to be referring to. So if you see me look down, it's because I want to make sure I don't miss anything as we're going through here. But the first thing to consider when you're filming an interview with no lights outside on location like this is to place your subject in the shade. It's going to give them a much softer look on their face and generally be more pleasing for most environments. The exception to this rule where I actually like direct sunlight for my subject is if I'm filming something that's more intense. So say I'm filming a football game, sometimes the contrast of one very dark side on a subject's face and one very light side can actually look good. But in most situations, including this, I think it's much better to position your subject in the shade. So here I have my subject standing in the shade and behind them is direct sunlight, and you can see the contrast between them in the shadows and then the very bright spot in the sun over their shoulder, and then this area which is getting some shade from this tree. The next thing we want to consider is the framing of your subject, and yes, the framing of your subject in the actual shot. So ideally, if you can consider at least the rule of thirds or center framing and like understand how you're framing your subject and why an audience's eye is going to be drawn there, that's good. But additionally, we want to consider framing your subject with elements in the shot. So in this shot specifically here, I've got this red plant framing my subject, and then I've also got this string here so that my subject is kind of positioned in between this rope and this plant, and it kind of cuts the frame down a little bit so that your eyes are more drawn to that middle area where the subject is positioned. And then have your subject look to the long side of the frame. So as this plays through here, you can see the subject isn't looking right at the camera. They're looking a little bit off to the side, and I'm standing just off to the left of the camera. And having my subject look to the long side of the frame by having myself stand to the left makes the whole interview look more inviting. When you short sight your subject by having them look to the short side of the frame, which would be if my subject was looking over here, that kind of creates this trapped type of feeling. And if there's a specific reason that you want that effect, I don't know, maybe you're filming a horror movie, then there's nothing wrong with short sighting your subject. But for something like this where we're trying to convey more positive emotions, it's more genuine, authentic content, I definitely want to make sure that our subject is looking to this long side and feels more open and inviting rather than sheltered and tense and nervous. Here's another example of an exterior interview with the same person. I've gone for a center framing look here, but you can see that again, I have them looking with plenty of room on this side, and I'm not positioning them any closer to the left while having them look that way because that would kind of feel trapped. What I did do in this shot, which I wish I did in the previous one, but didn't, is I filmed my subject from the shadow side of their face. In general, I just think filming from the shadow side of a subject's face looks more cinematic than filming from the bright side. Now, this isn't like a hard and fast rule you always have to follow. This shot over here, in my opinion, still looks good, and I have the bright side of their face being shown slightly more in the camera on that side. But filming from the shadowy side like this, I just think looks a lot better. You can see the fall off of the light, and it kind of draws you right to the subject's eye as this shadow leads right into it, and you're not really enticed to look at the subject's cheek because it's darker and not really a focal point. Apart from that, I pretty much followed the same principle for both of them to get these two on location exterior interviews. Now, this next shot that you're watching right now is a daytime interior interview. So this was actually filmed in a hotel room, so a controlled environment, but also not necessarily the nicest environment. So there's a couple of things I did differently to spruce it up or make it more acceptable when filming a subject on camera. First, you can see again that I'm filming my subject from the shadowy side of their face, and these shadows roll very nicely into my subject's eye. And then I've also got the background filled, and like I did in that previous interview, I'm kind of framing them with the items that I brought into the background. There wasn't a ton in this hotel room for me to work with, so I grabbed this table and this lamp and this table and just dragged it all into the frame and put it on either side of my subject to frame them up so that there would be something drawing your eye to them rather than just a plain white wall. I'm also shooting this interview into a corner. This gives me lots of depth of field. You can see the corner of the room is right here, and there's a dark side of the wall and the white side of the wall. And by positioning my subject here and shooting into the corner, the background is just blurrier, which is really good when you're in an undesirable environment like a hotel room that doesn't necessarily convey the story that you're trying to tell. When I was on location, the background shows kind of the story and makes sense with the narrative that I'm showing. But in a hotel room, the background is just plain. It doesn't actually contribute anything to the narrative. I'm just trying to make it not distracting. Now, if I was going to fix something about this shot, I would have loved to frame it up so that my subject is more on the rule of thirds. Maybe if I had punched in a little bit and filmed them kind of like this, something kind of like that, that could have been a lot nicer in my opinion. The only problem I have with this shot is now there's this giant white square right here that I just couldn't fill with anything that was in the room. So that's disappointing. But in spite of that, I don't think that this looks too bad. Now, as far as the actual light, this is just window light. So I've got my subject positioned facing a window, but not directly looking at the window, but rather slightly on an angle. So say the window was where this camera lens is right now, I would want to look this way if I were the subject of an interview. That way my face isn't flat, there's a bit of dimension and a bit of shadow on it. And then I pulled a sheer curtain over the window as diffusion, just so that the lighting wasn't as harsh if you have something like this on a location that you're shooting at, or if you can bring one of those like 5-in-1 reflector diffuser things to use to diffuse your light. That is awesome and goes a long way for making interviews look a lot better when you're filming them on location with limited resources like this. And then finally, I filmed this at a longer focal length. Again, my goal here was to give myself a shallow depth of field and just compress the background, the same reason I filmed into the corner. So that exterior interview that we filmed over here, this was at 35 mil, and then this interview here is at 50 mil. Now this final interview is a nighttime interior shot, and with no lights, a nighttime interior interview is incredibly difficult to film because you can't rely on the window to give you that beautiful natural daylight. So to light this shot, I actually used the lamp that you can see here from the previous shot. This is shot in the same hotel room, but this time instead of my subject facing the window, they are away from the window with the window right behind them covered by this curtain. So I've got that lamp, which was disgustingly warm. It was like 2500 Kelvin and just some really ugly light, wrapped in a sheer curtain, as you can see from this clip that I filmed just before we started filming the interview, hence why the camera is turned away in this clip. But that disgusting light is the main key light, which is light in the subject's face. And then there's slightly cooler temperature pothole lights in the ceiling of the room, which are lighting up the background here and providing like this kind of rim light on the subject's cheek. So there are a couple hot spots you can see like right here and right here, which aren't necessarily ideal, but it works for this type of setting where you're really limited in what you can do. Diffusing your light as much as you can helps. These sheer curtains were an absolute lifesaver. And I also positioned my subject as close as I reasonably could to a white wall so that I could get a little bit of fill on their shadowy side here so that it's not too harsh and contrasty. The things that I think save this shot in particular are the contrast between the subject and the background and the framing of the shot. So my subject is wearing a dark shirt, has dark hair, has dark skin, and so instead of shooting them on a dark background, which is what we would have if I didn't pull this blind across, because it would just be a dark nighttime setting with some bokeh and some lights from cars and signs in the background. By pulling this white curtain across, we now have a bright background with a dark subject on it. So your eyes are going to go to the dark subject that's talking and moving around and not focus as much on this plain background that isn't necessarily doing anything for me, but also isn't taking away from the shot or isn't giving off the vibe that we don't necessarily want for the topic that we're speaking to in this video. When I played it through, you can see that there's a little bit of bokeh moving around here. This is just from cars and stuff, so it gives me some level of visual interest as the interview is going. It's definitely a bit better and more textured than just a plain white wall. And then I also have this beige curtain over here just to frame my subject in a little bit. So instead of being completely flat, I was able to add like a little bit of texture over here. Again, I'm really just like was working with whatever I had here, but by pulling the curtains in this way, I'm able to make this background look reasonably neutral and somewhat interesting. And the framing of this is set to be pretty much perfectly following the rule of thirds, which I think makes this shot just that much more interesting and compelling. But because of that framing of this interview, I think I was able to make it at least passable and draw your eye to the subject and have you not focus so much on the ugly background or the terrible 2500 Kelvin hotel lamp lighting that I had to use to make this shot passable. If you have any other tips for filming interviews on location or with minimal gear and still making them look good, let me know in the comments. I'd love to chat up with you down there. But yeah, hopefully this helps you light your interviews more cinematically, even if you don't have lights. If you liked this video, please subscribe to the channel because I post videography and video editing tips and tutorial videos similar to this on a regular basis, and I would love to have you around for that. But until next time, peace.